My name is William Hemsworth. It's great to be with you all again today. My guest is Dr. Christina Francis, and she's the chair of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Dr. Francis, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. I thank you for taking some time to come on to discuss this fun topic that's going around the internet.
That's right.
So before we get started, though, could you tell our listeners a little bit more about you and the organization that you represent?
Absolutely. So I am a board certified OBGYN. I currently practice OB hospitalist medicine, so I'm based in the hospital. And like you said, I'm chair of the board of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we like to say AAPLOG. It's a little bit easier to say. So AAPLOG is actually the largest medical professional organization in the world that represents pro-life medical professionals. So we exist to represent our members who are mostly OBGYNs, but also made up of medical practitioners from various specialties, including midwives, and we even have a mental health professional subsection now as well. So really many types of people that are involved in medical care that desire to really emphasize the fact that medicine should be pro-life, that it should be practiced from a life-affirming standpoint to protect the life and health of all of our patients. So we exist to represent our members, but also to help inform the public and policymakers about not only the fact that preborn children are in fact human beings from the moment of fertilization, but also the evidence that exists that shows that abortion is very harmful for women as well.
Okay, well, great. I know recently you submitted a joint statement along with the American College of Pediatricians, the Catholic Medical Association, and Christian Medical and Dental Associations calling on the ethical vaccines, safety, efficacy, and ethical vaccines. Can you tell us a little bit more about this statement that you put out?
Absolutely. So, this is an issue really that has been talked about for many years, but really more on a small scale. And now, of course, with the COVID pandemic really bringing vaccine development kind of to the foreground, it's become an issue that thankfully many more people have become aware of. And so really the issue boils down to the fact that over the last 50 years or so, many vaccines have been developed using cell lines that were obtained from aborted fetuses. Now, some of this goes back to fetuses that were aborted in the 1960s. However, there are some cell lines in use that were obtained as recently as about 15 years ago. And then those cell lines then are propagated over years to use in the development and production of vaccines traditionally. There are also some like biological therapeutics that are used that use these same cell lines. And so really what we, the groups that join together for this statement are calling for is for companies that are producing vaccines to start to utilize more ethical means. So these are human cell lines. These are human beings that were aborted, and then their tissue is being used for experimentation. And so just like we would say that it is unethical to experiment without the consent of born human beings, it's also unethical to do experimentation without the consent of these preborn children that were killed through abortion, and then their tissue was used for scientific experimentation. So the good news is that there are ethical alternatives to these cell lines. So there are things out there that can be utilized by pharmaceutical companies to develop these vaccines. And thankfully, more and more pharmaceutical companies are starting to do that and realize that there are ethical alternatives to the traditional cell lines that they've used. The two vaccines that have been approved thus far from Pfizer and Moderna here in the US, thankfully, neither one of them were developed or produced using these fetal cell lines. So they were able to use ethical means to develop them. Both of the companies did use a fetal cell line called HEC 293 in their testing process. So once they had their vaccine developed, then they needed to test it to see if it was going to do what it was made to do. And unfortunately, both of those companies did use fetal cell lines to do the testing, most likely because they had it, that was the cell line they had available to them in their laboratory. However, again, there are ethical alternatives to those cell lines, even for the testing process. So we do applaud Moderna and Pfizer for utilizing ethical means for developing and producing that vaccine. What that means is that if you go in to get one of those vaccines, you can know that the product that's getting injected does not contain any human fetal cell lines, even though it was used in the testing process. So we certainly applaud them for utilizing ethical means to produce their vaccines. We just would encourage not only Moderna and Pfizer, but other companies as well, to move completely away from these fetal cell lines, because we do have ethical alternatives, not only for development and production, but also for testing.
What are some of those alternatives that you're talking about?
So there have been animal cell lines that have been used by other companies safely, and even things like eggs that have been used. Now, of course, you have to think about people with allergies as well for that. But there are most of the ethical alternatives that exist, even for other vaccines that have been developed in the past using these human fetal cell lines, utilize animal cell lines.
Okay. Now, you talked about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, how they don't use the human cell lines in their development. How did they use them? And because my audience we're a theology program. So
Sure.
how do they use those? How do they use those cell lines in the testing?
So I will give a disclaimer that I am not a laboratory scientist either.
Sure.
And we certainly rely heavily. Actually, I'm going to give this resource at the beginning for your listeners because I think it's an excellent resource. The Charlotte Lozier Institute is a research institute that actually has put out very good documents on ethical vaccines and how those are developed. And so they go into much broader detail, but just on kind of a very surface level. Basically, both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are very similar to one another in that they utilize mRNA technology to induce our body's cells, basically tricking our body's cells into thinking that the COVID virus is present. And it uses something called a spike protein that's present on the surface of the coronavirus. And that is one of the infectious parts of the coronavirus. And it uses that spike protein to kind of trick our body's cells into thinking that the coronavirus is present and induce antibody formation, which is one of our body's defense mechanisms against illness. And so in the testing, then what they did was they introduced this vaccine into a culture using these cell lines to see if those cells would then produce the antibodies that they were hoping they would. And from the data that we have right now, it seems like it's fairly effective at inducing antibody formation. So,
okay. Yeah, and that document that you gave a moment ago from the Lozier Institute is very clear. I mean, it uses green and red. Yeah. I mean, it's green good, red bad, basically.
That's right.
So what other companies out there are developing vaccines at the moment?
So there are many, many companies that are in this race, obviously, for a vaccine. And certainly the fact that this is a worldwide pandemic, we're going to need more than one company to be developing these vaccines. But a couple, that really stand out. One, the John Paul II Research Institute is working on an ethical vaccine that will be ethical from start to finish. So from development and production all the way through testing. One that comes to mind that is very prevalent, I think, in the UK, AstraZeneca, is kind of on the flip side of that. So they use human cell lines in the development and production as well as testing. So that would certainly be one that that we would call an unethical vaccine, and you'd certainly want to avoid that if this was a concern for you. But ultimately, I think the important thing, like you said, your listeners are not necessarily in the scientific field or in the medical field, but why I think it's really important that this be discussed amongst people in general, and why I think it's really important that it has kind of come to the forefront, is that we just need to be aware of this. So, many of us go to our doctors and we get our recommended vaccines, and we don't necessarily ask, how are these produced, and do I need to take pause to think, okay, I know that this sounds like a good thing, but is it, if it was produced in an unethical manner? And so, these are important things to discuss with your physician if you go to get any kind of vaccine. But, specifically, obviously, the COVID vaccine is the one that's kind of forefront in people's minds right now. And the other thing that I think that it's a really good thing for you to talk to your physician about is it's going to make your physician stop and think, was this vaccine that I'm recommending to my patients, was it ethically produced? And if so, then, then they can feel confident in recommending that to their patients. So, the other thing that I think this accomplishes is that it encourages your physician to do the research as well. And like I said, thankfully, we're getting more and more alternatives out there to those that were produced using fetal cell lines.
Now, do you think the pharmaceutical companies are becoming more aware of this objection that some people have with the fetal cell lines?
It certainly seems like it, because many of them, again, are kind of thinking outside of their standard box of how they've always done it and coming up with these ethical alternatives. And, the vaccine production process, big pharma, it works like any other market, right? So demand is going to drive innovation, and demand is going to drive the market. And so, again, the important thing in just the general public asking for ethical development of vaccines is the more that we ask for that, and the more we decline to receive vaccines that aren't developed in an ethical manner, and we ask for an alternative, the more we're going to drive the market towards that. And, at one point in time, it may have been that we didn't know about these other alternatives, but now we do. We know that they're out there. We know that they can be very successful. And so I think it's really important that the general public really ask about this. Again, ask your physicians, and as you're discussing options for different vaccines, asking about ethical alternatives and driving the market in that way. And if we do that, these companies will follow because, their bottom line is going to be impacted. And so I think it's important that we talk to our physicians about this, that we talk to one another, and that we talk about them even, in our churches, just encouraging one another to really demand ethical vaccines, ethical therapeutics, because that's what's going to move production in that direction.
Now, in the statement says that respect for life is foundational, and exploitation of the unborn for vaccine production is a violation of basic human rights. Can you go into a little more detail on that statement?
Sure. So, one of the things that we really try hard to emphasize, not only to our members and our patients, but also to the public, is that we have really irrefutable scientific evidence now that a new human life comes into existence at the moment of fertilization. Maybe your listeners might have heard a few years ago, there was a study that came out that said that over 95% of biologists agree that the moment that life begins is at the moment of fertilization. And so because of that, we know that because a human life comes into existence at that point, that human life has just as much worth as you or I. And so because of that, they deserve the same protections that we do. And we would stand against, certainly there's been evidence in history of medical experimentation on populations of people that were considered subhuman. I'm sure we can think of many different examples, but just a couple that come to mind are the experimentation that was done on Holocaust victims in concentration camps by the Nazi doctors, as well as like the Tuskegee Experiment that was done on African American men in this country, unfortunately. So there's been instances in the past where populations of human beings that were considered subhuman were considered okay to be experimented on. I would liken using fetal cell lines that were obtained from abortions. That's experimentation being done on human beings. Or things like embryonic stem cell research would fall under this same category. So embryos, even though they're very small, they are human beings. They're fully fledged human beings, and they don't deserve to be experimented on. And even though that might mean that at times we have to say, no to something that might appear to be a scientific advancement or may appear to have some good in treatment, we have to ultimately, our base has to be that we stand for the right of every single human being not to be inappropriately experimented on, regardless of the potential good that could be seen to come from that. So as an example, with the Tuskegee experiment, sure, we learned a lot about the natural course of syphilis, but it was highly unethical because we had this whole population of people who were infected with a serious infection and then treatment withheld from them that we knew would work to treat them. So even though it led to us learning a lot about the natural course of a disease, it still was not ethical, and it was very wrong, and it should have never happened. So
what would you say to those out there who have objections about getting the vaccine based on fetal cells being used?
So this is a very tough issue right now because all of us are facing this pandemic that has been, I'm sure you, like I, several times throughout this year, I've said, I feel like I'm living in a sci-fi movie. I mean, I never thought that something like this would happen. And so all of us are tired. We're tired of not being able to see our family. We're tired of having to take the precautions that we've had to take. Those of us who work in the hospital on the front lines are tired as well. All of us are ready for this to come to an end. However, that readiness for this to come to an end, the readiness for the death that has resulted from COVID to come to an end, that can't justify the abuse of other human beings. And so because of that, this is a very important thing for us to think through. And so, right now we kind of are in this position where we have 2 vaccines that have been approved that were developed in an ethical manner, thankfully. In their testing phase, they use unethical cell lines. And so we kind of find ourselves in a bit of a moral gray zone potentially for people. So there are going to be some people that say, I don't want to have anything to do with a vaccine that used fetal cell lines in any way, shape, or form, whether it be production or testing or whatever. I think that's a perfectly logical position to have. There are also other people who will say, I'm not going to utilize anything that used fetal cell lines in the development or production, but because those fetal cell lines are not actually being used in now the vaccines that are being produced and distributed, then I feel morally okay with that. I also can see the logic in that. And so I think really what it comes down to is being informed about how these vaccines were produced and then making the choice that you feel the most comfortable with. But as long as it's a thought out choice and you really have thought about this kind of ethical conundrum that we find ourselves in and worked through that issue for yourself, then I think that that's the most important thing. I also think as long as these ethical dilemmas exist, especially if some of these other vaccines that are in production that did utilize fetal cell lines during the production process, it's important for us to be aware of that so that if we get into a situation where someone is being pressured to get one of those vaccines, that they are armed with the information that they need to be armed with to say, this isn't ethical. And again, if we as a general public will be informed on this and will put pressure on the companies that are making these or maybe the entities that are distributing the vaccines to go more towards ethical alternatives, then the market will go that direction. But we might find ourselves in a situation where we have to take a bit of a hard position that goes a bit against the flow of what everyone else is thinking. But I think it's really important that we take this into consideration. And again, that's why AAPLOG, along with the other organizations, felt that it was very important that we put out a joint statement to say, look, there are physicians out there who acknowledge that this is a significant issue, and we want to stand behind our patients as they ask for more information on this.
Great. Now, Dr. Francis, where can our listeners learn more about you and your organization?
Absolutely. So I would encourage your listeners to check out our website. It's www.aaplog.org. We have a lot of really great resources on our website. Again, one of our our biggest emphasis is to present the evidence that exists, the scientific and the medical evidence that exists, that show that abortion not only ends the life of an innocent human being, but it's also really harmful to women. And, I really believe that abortion and the lies that have been told around abortion, the lies that it's empowering for women and that it's good for women, that it helps them get ahead in life, it really is kind of the biggest fleecing of women in history, just the lies that have been told to them. And so AAPLOG is standing as a medical organization. So we have partnerships with many religious organizations like the Catholic Medical Association and the Christian Medical and Dental Association, but we are specifically not a religious organization. We are a professional medical organization representing physicians and scientists that are there to attest to the fact that abortion is harmful for women. And there's a lot of really good information out there that people probably aren't hearing. And so that information is very accessible at our website. And I would highly encourage people to check out our website and to talk to your physician. If you're a woman and you go to see an OBGYN, ask them if they know about AAPLOG. And if not, then please refer them to our website because we'd love to give them information as well.
Great. And again, the website is www.aaplog.org. And Dr. Francis, I thank you for taking some time today to come on and talk about this important topic. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. God bless.
You too.
Thanks.